Welcome to Our National Conversation, a podcast in which we discuss politics from all angles. We are completely nonpartisan and all views respectfully stated are welcomed here. Our podcast is unique in that we blend the energy and passion of our student interns with the insights and wisdom that come from experienced professionals. Our focus is on problem solving, not finger pointing.
Welcome everyone to this edition of Allow Us to Explain. My name is Jordan Broking and I serve as the Director of Media here at ONC. In today's episode, we are focusing on a hot button issue when it comes to American politics nowadays, from both the health side and social issue side. The issue, cannabis and legalization towards it. We've seen some states legalize it, other states not legalize it. We've also seen in this country's history different stigmas surrounding the use of cannabis, and also more so discussions on the use of medical marijuana. So where do all these issues stand when it comes to cannabis legalization, and how can different legislators and just the everyday citizen go about this and really either bring change or start to bring this to the table even more when we're talking about politics? So before we get started, let me introduce our panelists. Today, we are joined by social issues member Natia Skorupski and healthcare team lead Rishit Yoganath. So, Rishit and Natia, welcome to Allow Us to Explain. Natia, this is not your first rodeo here at Allow Us to Explain, so I'll let you introduce yourself first.
Hi, my name is Natia Skorupski. I'm a recent graduate and I currently am a substitute teacher, but I work at Our National Conversation as a social issues intern, so I'm excited to be here.
Great. Well, welcome. And Rishit, would you mind introducing yourself, please?
Yeah, so my name is Rishit. I'm the healthcare policy lead here at ONC, and I'm a neuroscience major at UT, and I'm definitely looking forward to speaking about this topic.
Great. Well, welcome to one of your first times, I believe, on this podcast in a while. So nice to have you. So let's get this conversation started. So obviously, there's definitely going to be a lot of questions surrounding the process of legalizing cannabis and its impacts on multiple sectors of our society. Obviously, healthcare and social issues being the biggest ones, because obviously the use of cannabis can affect anyone's health. And it's starting to become a more social thing for people to do, whether they're smoking it or doing other forms of it. So let's kind of go and get the conversation started when it comes to legalization behind it. So Rishit, when we're talking about cannabis legalization, how does that impact human health and the healthcare system?
Well, the legalization of cannabis just allows more people to get access to this resource, especially the trend we've been seeing with more states legalizing it. And cannabis has been widely studied within healthcare, and there are numerous health benefits and downfalls to cannabis as well. So some health benefits, according to experts, is that we all know about the utility of medical marijuana. Just to give some examples of its effects, it's used in managing chemotherapy side effects. So like some THC-based medications are actually FDA approved, and they're used to treat nausea, vomiting, and appetite and weight loss. Also, there's MS or multiple sclerosis spasticity. So whenever there's muscle rigidity that can happen, this is actually approved as a medication with THC and CBD, which is called Sativex. So that is widely used to treat stiffness and spasms introduced by MS. Also, chronic pain that is that's widely known to be treated with a THC and CBD, with specifically nerve damage, inflammation, and altered function of sensory pathways. And even with sleep apnea, so obstructive sleep apnea, migraines, neuropathy, appetite loss, inflammatory bowel disease, rheumatoid arthritis, there's so many different effects and positive side effects that medical marijuana can have. Of course, this doesn't come up without its disadvantages. So some negative side effects include panic, anxiety, which would be like a bad trip, drowsiness, a dry mouth, impaired motor function, elevated heart, and even dizziness. And of course, since a very common form of intaking marijuana is smoking, of course, there's smoking risks with pulmonary disease or potentially mixing cannabis with tobacco. Of course, the combination of cannabis and mental health issues is also one that could potentially lead to neurological and physical risk, especially with those who are predisposed to mental illnesses like schizophrenia and psychosis. And of course, its interactions with other drugs could be potentially negative. So yeah, those are some of the healthcare aspects of that.
Thank you. And I know it seems to be a lot of both benefits and negatives when it comes to using it. So, Nadia, when we're looking at it from the social issues side of this, how does legalization of cannabis and marijuana tend to affect policy in that nature?
I think our view of cannabis has become antiquated, and it has built off of the war on drugs that started in the 70s. War on drugs was an operation and campaign for the United States to crack down on the use of drugs, including marijuana. But it became very clear that it was targeting lower socioeconomic areas, which tended to be areas full of people of color and minorities. And instead of it being a legitimate action to crack down on the use of illegal drugs, it slowly became something tied to race and ethnicity and poor economic status. And that's continued throughout the years of this illustration and ties of marijuana to a certain group of people. And so it's, instead of it being just about following the law, it's instead about cracking down on certain ethnicities and minorities. And therefore, we have this large issue currently where we have thousands, millions of people in jail for minor drug charges related to marijuana. And although we're making progress in terms of decriminalization of marijuana and legalization in some areas, there's still this issue tied to people of color and marijuana, and this inherent bias against people. And it's, instead of this being a medical or healthcare tied avenue of talking about drugs, it's related to race, which is very important to think about when we have this conversation on cannabis.
Definitely. And both points are major talking points when it comes to states choosing to either legalize it or not legalize it, because as we know, the US hasn't made a whole big legislation yet, a whole national legislation towards legalizing it, but we are seeing some states legalize it here, other places not. Most of the time tends to be more northern states are starting to legalize it, and more southern states and more red states are still not legalizing it. This is due to a few different things. We've seen those viewpoints being that it could be addicting. It could also, that a lot of people who are anti-marijuana are just like anti-drug in general, just because of the addiction standards when it comes to it. But when it comes to marijuana, it's not the most addictive substance, I don't think. So, when we're talking about this, the CDC considers marijuana to be a class 1 drug, meaning that even though in some states they have legalized the use of medical marijuana for small amounts of it, otherwise, or state or nationwide, it's still not a currently accepted medical use, and according to the CDC, it still has a high potential for abuse. So when we are talking about this, why do we believe that the CDC hasn't changed this generalization of marijuana, or this classification really marijuana when we're talking about this? Or do we think that it still should be, moved to a different class of drugs? Just because I know personally I've taken a drug safety course in college, and that was a big talking point, whether it should be moved out of it or not out of it. More times people say that it shouldn't be a class 1 drug anymore, that it's not, it doesn't have the highest potential of abuse anymore, or that's what some people say. So what do we think when we're talking about that?
Well, when we think of the classification of drugs, class 1 or schedule 1 drugs are the kind of highest and most strict level for DEA. And to give you an idea, schedule 1 drugs, some other examples of those in that classification are stuff like heroin or LSD or MDMA or bath salts. And I think that I think from research and from what we know, we can't really put marijuana in the same classification of addictive substances like heroin. And the fact that they are classified in the same group shows that there's still an evident stigma against marijuana. And I think as we are as research is showing the benefits of using the drug in comparison to other drugs, having that harsh classification is inherently harmful in the sense that it prevents medical professionals from being able to properly do research, to properly kind of get away from the stigma. And so we have this idea of stigma still bogging down true evidence. And so I think having this classification is harmful to an extent because it comes from antiquated research, whereas more evidence shows from, and I shouldn't assume that healthcare, Rishit could step in on this, shows that we can't really put marijuana and heroin in the same classification. So
Yeah, exactly. It's not like comparable with heroin or anything, but marijuana, there are still some significant health risks of using it. It's not like a completely something where like nothing will happen. And like I could go a little bit more into some of the risks of cannabis and some more facts and statistics that might give insight and into why it was placed as a class one drug and kind of provides us like the counter viewpoint to that. So why some people may say it still deserves to be as a class one, but uh, of course, we all know that it is the most commonly used illegal substance in our country, and we all know of how addictive it could be. But just to give a little more statistics about that, 1 in 10 people who use marijuana can become addicted. And if you look at people under the age of 18, which is a pretty large demographic of marijuana users, 1 in 6 people who use marijuana in that age demographic become addicted. And some more facts about the effects of marijuana is that it could cause permanent IQ loss and even 8 points if it's used at a young age, like below 18. And even if the use is stopped, some of these points will never come back. So it does impair your intelligence a little bit. And of course, there's extensive research showing that it is linked to depression, suicide planning, anxiety, and psychotic episodes. It's not necessarily known that the use causes these conditions, but there's like a high correlation. So, of course, more literature review needs to be done and everything like that. And of course, marijuana, the side effects of it make you drowsy and everything. It affects timing, movement, coordination, and athletic performance. And of course, driving under the influence is obviously something that is very harmful because of slow reaction time, lane weaving, and decreased coordination. And if we just talk about pregnancy use, use during pregnancy use is also harmful because that could cause a lot of fetal growth restriction, premature birth, risks for stillbirth, and problems with brain development. And what is interesting and more about the science behind this, we all know THC is a chemical within marijuana, but through breast milk, THC can actually be passed, and that actually impacts the child's development. If you look at THC, the concentration of THC in marijuana today versus what it was 25 years ago, it is thought that it is 3 times higher than what it was before. So, of course, this means that there's stronger effects on the brain and more higher rates of addiction, dependency, and potentially more effects to child development. So, and just some more correlations between marijuana and other conditions. Research shows that people who use marijuana could have more relationship problems, whereas educational outcomes and low career achievement. So, besides the potential health effects that are considered positive, there's also negative health risks that need to be assessed as well. So yeah, that's a little bit about that counter people.
yeah, and I also think a good point to bring into it is the fact that a lot of the side effects of marijuana are also can be side effects for alcohol usage as well, but we don't view alcohol and marijuana, we view them very differently. So the fact that alcohol doesn't have the stigma that marijuana does, yet a lot of the consequences of marijuana are also consequences of extended alcohol usage, I think is very interesting to point out.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, I think both of you kind of like hit the nail on the head when it comes to, why there is still stigma to it a little bit here and there. And also just, how people view this compared to other drugs that are used. I think a point that Nadia brings up is that not a lot of people consider alcohol a drug, even though people have called it that, whether how much you drink of it or anything like that. So let's talk about the stigma behind it, because there's a few different stigmas that are coming out of this when we're talking about cannabis use and cannabis legalization. One that Nadia mentioned earlier is, racism towards it, and the racism of, cannabis use and marijuana use, just because, in the past, or just according to different studies and everything, Black men and women tend to have increased exposure to it. And this increase in exposure tends to lead to an increase in racial profiling, where law enforcement then focus their anti-cannabis use movements towards POC communities rather than other communities that are in our, states and nation as a whole. And due to this, there have been issues where law enforcement have used both lethal and violent efforts towards combating it. And unfortunately, Black Americans tend to receive the harsher punishment for using and possessing it rather than white Americans. So, Nadia, I'll kind of let you start off with this. When we're talking about race and cannabis use, what does that look like nowadays compared to when, this, as you call it, antiquated research was really being done? And what are some steps that we're starting to see in our current society today that are starting to combat this issue?
Well, I think the discussion of marijuana becoming more public and becoming more mainstream is helpful towards fighting against the this idea that it's only in minority communities where we use this drug. Regardless of socioeconomic status or race, people are using marijuana, and putting it in this idea that it's this main group causing all of this quote unquote trouble or problems is just focusing on racist and classist thinking in many ways. And so having the discussion, making it more mainstream as this is a conversation we need to have everywhere. And it's not about who's doing it. It's more about the fact that people are using the drug in the first place. And I think with police and involving the conversation on police addressing using the law to enforce kind of not using the drug and whatnot, I think there's still racial profiling. Of course, we constantly see in the news of issues with racial profiling from police enforcement, but I think we are ultimately stuck in decades of thinking and a perspective that hasn't really gone away. We've made changes in terms of how we view marijuana and how we view the people who use the drug and the drug itself. But I think people in positions of power still don't have that changed mindset. And therefore, it's hard for us to let go of it and move forward to a more updated and more factual way of thinking. So ultimately, having this conversation in a more mainstream context, the conversation that we're having now federally of whether we should legalize marijuana, that we couldn't have had that conversation decades ago. And so the fact that we're having this conversation shows change and shows that we're eventually moving away from classist and racist thinking towards this idea of this drug isn't going to go away. People aren't going to stop using it. So what can we do to prevent us from criminalizing it further and sending thousands of people, and mostly minorities, into prisons for minor charges over marijuana? Instead of doing what we used to do, which is throwing tons of people in jail over minor issues, we're trying to change that, and we couldn't have had that conversation, like I said before. So I think we are making slow changes, but it doesn't help that a lot of the people in power have grown up with the mindset of the war on drugs and the mindset of it being a problem that minorities have or something like that. And I think because a lot of the people in power today are much on the older side, we still haven't been able to move away towards more forward and factual thinking.
Definitely. And I think also kind of going back to the comparison of, marijuana compared to other drugs and everything, that we have seen other drugs in the past be, strictly, hammered down when it comes to that you can't use it. Obviously, I think the biggest example of one of these strike downs was prohibition in the US when it came to alcohol. That only lasted for 15 years. But as you said, Nadia, a bunch of these leaders who are in power still have the same beliefs as they did back when the war on drugs was still a big issue. And that time period when it came to drugs, obviously now we are 40 plus years past that. So, when we're talking about ending the stigma, not just when it comes to racist, stigmas, but also just the stigma of just using it in general. Both of you can chime in on this. How can we start to, get more legalization on the tables? How can we start to, speak with our lawmakers and try to, I guess, quote unquote, educate them more when it comes to the issue? This way, more effective present day laws can be passed with regards to it, and we can move behind the antiquated research that Nadia brings up. So what do you both think when it comes to that? How can we move forward and start to end the stigma and get our lawmakers to also start to see that change?
Well, I think a big part of that is also us as a nation recognizing the racism past behind the stigma behind cannabis, like the stigma behind cannabis in general, and just realizing that. So just to give some context on that, the 1937 Act actually started the federal prohibition of cannabis, and prohibition continued with the Controlled Substance Act. As you said previously, that it's considered a Schedule 1 drug with potential for abuse and no medical use. So even that act back then, they had no idea it was used for medical use, even though other countries, and I could speak that for this on my behalf, because India, like the Indus Valley civilization, like all those years back, and even in many religious texts, like thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, there's medical uses of cannabis. There's like special like medical purposes of that, and that's always been a thing. But in the 1937 Act, they said there's no medical use, and they even correlated it with much, much more serious drugs like heroin and methamphetamine. And of course, these ideas weren't founded on scientific ideals at all. And we talked about it as well, but we have to recognize that these first anti-cannabis campaigns started as a racist way to control a lot of these minority groups, especially those that are using cannabis. And even a lot of very interesting ideas like it's a shortcut to an insane asylum, or people thinking that it's like a murder drug that would lead people in India to violence. Like it was shown that lots of these like stigmatized ideas were actually from the same journalists promoting these potentially racist ideas. So, and of course, it also said that cannabis turned men to violence, women to sexual promiscuity, and that's not heavily supported by research. And these are still ideas that float around, especially with the older generations. So just recognizing these ideas are, and how many of them are false, I think that's a really important step in the right direction for sure, and just addressing stigma head on.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think fighting misinformation with facts and evidence, we've luckily come to an age where there has been tons of medical research on marijuana to show its potential benefits. And of course, every drug is going to have its side effects and its issues. I mean, in regular medications, there's going to be side effects for people. So I wouldn't necessarily say the consequences of marijuana are severe in comparison to any other drug we use today. I think what we could do and what could serve the conversation is drawing comparisons of marijuana to other drugs that we use today, like alcohol. I mean, we view drugs, prescriptions that we take today in a completely different light than we would marijuana, even though medical marijuana exists and is prescribed in different states and whatnot. Our perception is what develops the conversation regarding a prescription or a drug. And I think changing our perception and going away from fear is probably the most important thing, because ultimately when we grow up hearing about marijuana, I think we have this like inherent fear that it's this bad, horrible thing to do. And because we classify it in certain ways with much more severe drugs, we kind of want to easily loop it in as this major issue. But what we need to understand is that it's going to get done. People are going to use the drug, just as anyone's going to use a prescription drug or drink alcohol. We can't, by criminalizing this drug, by prohibiting its usage, it's not going to stop people from using it. If anything, it's just going to put more people in prison and cost money and taxes and be harmful, because we already know that the prison system has its own issues. So the point I'm trying to make is we having this idea that prohibiting the use of a drug is actually a useful thing and is actually helpful to do in terms of preventing drug usage doesn't work. If we thought that making drugs illegal stop people from using them, then we wouldn't have all of these drug problems, like with opiate usage and heroin usage and all that. We wouldn't have that today if just making something illegal actually worked. So the point of the matter is, regardless of your perspective of whether you think marijuana is a good drug or bad drug, quote unquote, it's still going to get used by people, and criminalizing it and making it this legal issue doesn't do anything except create more harm. It doesn't steer people away from using it. People are going to use it no matter what. So moving forward towards legalization creates avenues for safer usage and the prevention from people mixing marijuana or other things with more harmful chemicals and issues like that. Ultimately, moving away from our old-minded thinking and how we all were raised, and kind of thinking of the bigger picture of how can we create the least amount of harm possible, is probably the mindset we need to be adopting when looking at marijuana.
And that's actually a good point. Like, obviously all your points are good, but I think another good point to talk about is the fact that regardless of not if cannabis is legalized or illegalized, people are still going to use it regardless if it's a law, if it's not a law, or if it's legal, it's not legal. And I think that's been a growing issue nowadays, especially in recent weeks, when it comes to illegal cannabis consumption. I know, for instance, in New York State, last week, the state announced a big statewide crackdown on shops that were still selling illegal cannabis. I know 30 of them, there are 30 shops so far that they found illegal drugs or illegal cannabis in. They've already issued fines to that. In Massachusetts, they have the Cannabis Control Commission, so they're the ones that are also working to, help both those who produce cannabis while also helping those who use cannabis find, healthy, legal ways of actually getting access to it and smoking it, and or however they consume it, really. So when we're talking about legalizing this more so further, how can people start to, I guess, look at ways of ensuring that the cannabis that they buy from either a shop or something else is legalized. It's not like an illegal substance that they're buying, because sometimes they might go into a shop and they'll claim it's legal, but then it's maybe not legal. So how can we better legislation wise help people identify that the marijuana they're buying is legal compared to the ones that are not legal? How can we better do that legislation wise?
Legislation wise, I think it's important, as I said, from all the previous talking points, it's very important to not only take into the social demographic factors into account, also the culture behind the use of marijuana is very different among different race groups. Some think it's normal, it's not very stigmatized. Also, the health risks and effects. There needs to be a modern, detailed, balanced report because in reality, what Nadia said, lots of the effects of marijuana, like they're shared with other drugs that do not have stigma, like alcohol. So I think for affecting legislation, showing if there needs to be more legalization, I think the step in the right direction would be to show the similarities of side effects it has with different drugs like alcohol. Of course, it has its own unique side effects, but lots of it is shared, and I think that could help reduce the stigmatization. And if some people want to go for a more legal route, that could be the right steps. And of course, also addressing how it is heavily implicated in socioeconomic factors. And also, we have to take into account with the cannabis industry, lots of uh, local people, entrepreneurs, cannabis businesses are also very massive. There's lots of entrepreneurs who go from zero to millions of dollars and their whole business is based off cannabis use, and it's becoming more and more accepted. So if we compile reports of this and how more people are using it to even benefit the economy as well, because technically it is benefiting the economy through the cannabis business. I feel like a holistic report or reporting that would definitely help with more legalization and change a lot of legislation for sure, even for those who might have a little bit more conservative viewpoints, just potentially seeing that some of those points may be a little outdated.
Yeah, I agree, especially the fact that we are benefiting economically from the use of marijuana, and I think people don't want to make that realization, but use of drugs like marijuana is very much contributing to our society in a positive way. But regardless, regarding the legalization of marijuana in legislation and choosing to pursue legal versus illegal cannabis as a user, I think if you are using cannabis and you're going to a store and you're not sure if what they're giving you is legal or not, I think that it's not on. I think we're in a current societal point where users aren't going to really care whether what they're doing is, whether their use of marijuana is legal or illegal. If they want it, they're gonna take it. If so, kind of, if they're in a state where it is legalized and they choose and they don't know whether the product they're getting is fully legal or not, I don't think it's going to matter. I think as long as they have the access to it, that's what matters to the user. I know from experience, a lot of people don't, when they choose to use marijuana, knowing that they might be using it illegally in a state that prohibits usage of it, if they think they need it, they're going to pursue it. I've known a lot of people who have severe chronic illness and kind of need something like marijuana to survive and to get through the day and to continue on their lifestyle. So for them, choosing to use marijuana isn't just, oh, I'm going to break a law. It's, I'm going to break this law to have a better quality of life. So I think this idea that the user has to choose whether they want to pursue something legally or not. It's not necessarily about that. It's more of, it maybe is, it is if you're using it recreationally, but there are a lot of people who use it to survive and to get through their life. And I think that's another avenue of the conversation to pursue, is that the use of marijuana isn't just a recreational tool, it's a medical necessity for a lot of people. And it's incredibly important for them to just get through their days and to feel a little bit better. So having this legislation that criminalizes that kind of behavior doesn't make logical sense. Because we're essentially saying these people shouldn't have a better quality of life and shouldn't be a little bit less pain-free just because of laws. That doesn't really make sense. If we put this strictly in a recreational conversation, sure, you can make it more about legal specifics, but when it comes to people who are using this as a medical necessity, it's much more important to question why we have this drug, why we prohibit it in the first place, when it's not like heroin, or it's not like something else that is quite harmful. It's something that's actually helping and saving lives, and yet we criminalize people who use it. So I think that's another point of the conversation when we question why we haven't moved forward towards legalization, is why are we essentially harming people and prohibiting them from pursuing a better quality of life.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I want to go back to the health, components of this, both the significant benefits and also the significant risks, as Rishit has been saying, because as we are starting to turn towards more people starting to use it, we're also starting to see more people use alternatives to it. They're not just smoking it, they're either, consuming it via edible gummies, as we have started to see rise in popularity nowadays. And we've also just seen people start to use CBD supplements nowadays, where that's just included in, vitamins or other type of supplements they just may take on a daily basis or weekly basis, however often they take it. So what are the benefits and I guess even disadvantages when it comes to those alternatives? Do the benefits and disadvantages outweigh the ones for typical or the usual, or I guess original use of marijuana, or are some of these products starting to be a little safer when it comes to this and a little bit more well used when it comes towards the country?
Well, of course, different alternatives like cannabis, of cannabis, such as edibles, like lots of like the respiratory and lung issues that may be associated. That doesn't happen. So, or it's very less of a factor for health effects. So, even CBD supplements, like it's pretty known. The literature shows that it's not going to provide the detriment that smoking marijuana does. Like smoking anything necessarily, like that's going to damage your lungs. So lots of these different supplements, they've been made to avoid a lot of those respiratory effects. Of course, there is obviously some different disadvantages even with these different alternatives of marijuana, and they may not even be health related, just associated with the healthcare system. So, for example, just receiving a medical marijuana card, it's very different for each state. So even if you're traveling across different states, it may be like different and everything like that. And of course, it's not for everybody. So it's very important that as medical marijuana becomes more accessible within the healthcare industry, our healthcare experts, everyone becomes more educated about this topic, the latest literature, and everyone just is on top of their game so that they can make sure any patients who need medical marijuana receive the right attention, and any alternatives other than marijuana are also given. But yeah, there's a lot of potential as it's an emerging field, and especially with a lot of these different alternatives. Marijuana has become a lot more accessible, and especially throughout college, use of gummies and everything like that. That's definitely like a larger thing. And I know I've the amount of CBD stores that have opened up near me, like when I was in high school to like now when I'm a college student, I see like so much more. So yeah, it's definitely becoming a much larger factor and more accepted. But yeah, those are just some of my thoughts.
Yeah, I think the fact that we've been able to find different avenues of using marijuana that take away from some of the side effects is kind of a huge growth. And I think the use of CBD supplements, I think, is actually far separated from using marijuana to the point that it has less of a stigma and is more socially accepted to use something that has CBD in it versus saying, "Oh, I smoke this." It's interesting that now that we've found all these multiple forms, each form has different varying stigmas to it, and I think the fact that we've gone to the created CBD supplements has become a commercialization of marijuana that's become more socially acceptable. So it's interesting that we have now this kind of business of using this product and finding ways to kind of skirt the stigma that's been prevailing the use of marijuana for years. And I think it's also been very helpful to have a differentiation of products that are specifically tied to different benefits. So, I mean, we have like CBD oil, CBD supplements, edibles, stuff like that. The point of it is to kind of be more targeted towards being beneficial. And I think it's a huge growth. And I think having this kind of accessibility to create these products has been very helpful towards steering away from older stigma.
Definitely. And before I move on to my next question, or actually my last questions actually, Rishit, for those who may not know about this, you touched upon the point of the medical marijuana cards, about those who have them. So could you, for those who may not know a lot about them, could you talk about that for a bit, like about what they are and how they may differ state to state?
I mean, of course, whenever you're purchasing medical marijuana products or anything like that, you have to actually receive a doctor's prescription or recommendation in order to even be applicable for a medical marijuana card. And you would just use this medical marijuana card in different stores if you're going to use it for medical purposes. So, of course, this is like a recent, thing. Like it hasn't been around for a long time. So it's just a form of like regulation, just making sure that those who need marijuana, those who need it for medical reasons, are getting it. So yeah, that's a little bit about these marijuana cards. And of course, as I discussed earlier, there's a little bit of disparities because there's different processes per state, and some people who need the medical use, they don't have the resources to go to the doctor or even receive the doctor's prescription. So of course, there's disparities in that itself within communities, but also if you look statewide and nationwide, like it's not like every state has the same exact process. It's not like a nationally equal process. Every state is different. Some states it's more heavy than, for example, Colorado in the process of receiving the medical marijuana card. So since it's a still new kind of thing that we've developed, there still needs to be a lot more research and advocacy done for this, and we just need to make sure that the processes across countrywide are the same, especially for medical marijuana use, because that is completely different from like casual use, in my opinion. So yeah.
Definitely. And to kind of wrap things up here, because I know we talked about what needs to be done to start to end the stigma some more. We've also spoken about some of the ways that we need to start addressing it on the health side of it, because as Rashid mentioned earlier, if people just go the smoking route, sometimes that can lead to lung damage. And I think we've all seen the commercials on TV and online about how it damages the lungs, not just from marijuana, but also just vaping as well, which is another side bit to this. So where do we see the future of cannabis legalization? Do we see more states and more legislators starting to pass it and maybe approve it here and there as time goes on? Or do we see more hurdles coming up when it comes to federally passing this as a law? What do we both see when it comes to that?
I want to be hopeful and say that we get to a point of legalization, but if I don't know if that would even happen in my lifetime. But I think at the very least, I could see further decriminalization. So not moving forward to the complete legalization, but at least moving to decriminalization. I think it's a good middle ground for people on both sides to kind of adopt. Is just this idea of it's not completely legalizing marijuana, but it's at least preventing countless people from going to jail over minor charges. And considering the increased recidivism rate of people going back to jail once they are in jail, I think it's a good, helpful cause to come around of this idea that if we prevent people from going to jail in the first place, we can prevent people from going back to jail just over minor charges. So I think I see more states adopting decriminalization at the very least. Ideally legalization, but yeah.
And I feel like medical marijuana, many people who don't, the many people against it, they're not even educated about it. So I feel like as time goes on, more education efforts are revisited and are ramped up. I feel like the use of medical marijuana nationwide, like it's going to be very common. So I'm already seeing it right now in Texas, and it's not like Colorado is completely different, but there's still a lot of medical marijuana involvement. So I expect to see medical marijuana to be large and just increase and scaled up as a business. Absolutely. But for normal marijuana use, I think reduced stigmatization will happen, and of course the decriminalization efforts. But as a country becomes divided, and it is still divided, and because of the process of political gridlock, it is obviously still somewhat difficult to pass a lot of legislation. Of course, the whole reason why we're making this podcast is marijuana is a controversial topic. So hopefully, as more advocacy and everything goes on, we can get to the point where it becomes decriminalized and it becomes a little bit more common. But of course, because America is in a somewhat divided right now, that will take a lot of effort, and it is definitely in our hands to do something about that.
Absolutely. So at least we are gonna be hopeful when it comes to decriminalizing it further and also reducing the stigma around it. So hopefully that pans out in another however many years it takes. Hopefully it's still during Nadia's lifetime so she can actually witness it. So all right, so I believe that is pretty much this episode of Allow Us to Explain. So thank you, Natia and Rishit, for taking part in this conversation. Thank you to those at home who also listened. Next time on one of our future episodes, we'll also be talking about opioid use across the country and the opioid epidemic. So be sure to stay tuned for that episode. But until then, have a great rest of your day.
This podcast was brought to you by Our National Conversation, a place where students generate policy solutions to the biggest problems facing America. Join us in free and political dialogue from hyperpartisanship. To learn more about what you heard today, check us out at ournationalconversation.org. You can follow us on social media at Our National Conversation to show your support and keep up with our latest efforts.